All right, so now for something a little bit different. Um, we've been hearing a lot about the use of multispectral data for cropland extent and irrigated rain-fed mapping. Now I'm going to be talking about hyperspectral data and using that for crop type mapping. So we're in a really exciting era, right? We have a lot of hyperspectral data that have been recently launched and are planned to be launched. So for example, we've had the old generation Hyperion data, we have new generation DESIS and NMAP from Germany, we have the Italian Prisma, we have upcoming Tanager launches. So this is a really exciting era to be looking at and using hyperspectral data and figuring out how best to use these hyperspectral data for various applications. So one reason to use hyperspectral data is because these signatures that you get from hyperspectral data, like you see the green signature here from NMAP, can tell you a lot of information that multispectral data might not be able to provide. The multispectral Landsat data are shown here in the dots along that spectral profile. And here's an example of hyperspectral capabilities, like for crop classification. You see here barley and wheat are not so easily differentiated using Landsat bands, but very clearly differentiated using hyperspectral narrow bands. So we can also use hyperspectral data for various other applications like disease detection, estimation of crop biophysical and biochemical characteristics, and yield and biomass prediction. But to use various models to do those applications, we, as Partha mentioned, we need to get training and validation data. So we are now compiling a global spectral library, GISA, for doing this very thing. So we want to incorporate hyperspectral data from multiple sensors, agroecological zones, so basically precipitation and temperature regimes, different growing conditions, different years and times of year. And here is an example of GISA for Prisma data for different crop types. You can see some pretty big differences between these crop types here. So we've already published some GISA data in LPDAC, like Partha mentioned, and we also have some in the USGS science-based catalog, and we're working with global collaborators to grow this data set even more. Now we can use entire spectral profiles for full spectral analyses, which are one example of which is spectral matching techniques, which Partha mentioned. And for this full spectral analysis, we look at the shape of the entire spectral profile and match it to our reference spectral profiles, for example. So that's one philosophy. The second philosophy for using hyperspectral data is selecting optimal hyperspectral narrowbands, or OHNBs, for analyses. And we can do that with various methods like principal components analyses, peak and trough detection, etc. And here's one example of a lambda by lambda correlation plot, which tells you which pair of narrowbands is best for such things as estimating biomass. So the hotspots here are really good pairs, band pairs for estimating various characteristics. So today I'm going to discuss very shortly, or very briefly, 3 different studies which we use for investigating the performance of new generation hyperspectral data and deep learning techniques for studying agricultural crops. So the first objective was to study sensor characteristics of Germany's DESIS and Italy's Prisma, develop spectral libraries of agricultural crops like GISA I mentioned earlier, classify key irrigated crops with OHNBs, and support vector machines like Prasad and Partha mentioned earlier, compare classification results of full spectral analyses versus OHNBs using 3 machine learning algorithms, implement a deep learning model, artificial neural networks, for crop classification, and then discussing hyperspectral vegetation indices generated using OHNBs. Before getting into the different studies, I wanted to spend a few minutes looking at the differences and commonalities between Germany's DESIS and Italy's PRISMA. So all three, or all two, are spaceborne, but DESIS is on the International Space Station, whereas PRISMA is polar orbiting. DESIS collects data in the visible to near infrared region, whereas PRISMA also has information in the shortwave infrared region. The original DESIS data are in one bin, a one bin product, which means we have 235 bands of data, with each band being about 2.55 nanometers in bandwidth. This is in comparison to PRISMA, which has 238 bands, but a band width of 12 nanometers, 10 to 12 nanometers. All of them have 30-meter spatial resolution and swath widths of 30 kilometers. Now, DESIS also recently came out with a 4-bin product, which has a similar spectral range, but 60 bands that are each around 10 nanometers, more comparable to the PRISMA bandwidths. So I'll be talking about using both of these 1-bin and 4-bin in the later studies. So all of these studies took place in Fresno, California. The first two studies I'm going to mention used DESIS and PRISMA images, whereas the third study that I want to talk about used Landsat time series data and deep learning, that AN model. So the first objective was to study sensor characteristics of DESIS and PRISMA. If we wanted to use data from both sensors at once, we need to be able to say, okay, so if we have this amount of reflectance for DESIS, that means that this is the probable reflectance for PRISMA, for example. So we ran some linear regressions and found that R-squared values were pretty high at 0.91 when all crops were looked at together. And even with individual crop types, the R-squared values were quite high. And this is with PRISMA and DESIS images that were 1 day apart in June 2020. Here's a similar intersensor comparison again between DESIS and PRISMA, this time with August 2021 data. This time the images were almost 2 weeks apart, but still we had a high R-squared value of 0.96 to 0.97 across all these different crop types. Then we wanted to develop spectral libraries for DESIS and PRISMA. And here's an example of DESIS 1-bin data at the top left here, and then DESIS 4-bin data at the top right. You can see that the 10 nanometer bandwidths lead to a much smoother spectral profile, but we might have also lost some data in that smoothing. So it's something to keep in mind. And then the PRISMA examples are at the bottom that you've seen earlier. Now, we want to make GISA robust so it can be used by multiple researchers for validating their machine learning models. So we want to include various variables, like these DESIS spectra are from June and August 2020, capturing some the crop types in different growth stages. And we want to include data from multiple sensors as well. So here you see a comparison between June spectra from DESIS and PRISMA. Then we wanted to do crop type classification using these data. And one way to do this, as Prasad mentioned, is using optimal hyperspectral narrowbands. So we selected bands that could basically summarize information spectrally across the entire spectral profile into a few bands. And here they're represented in the vertical lines in the DESIS data and in the PRISMA data. And then we used 2 machine learning algorithms for one of the studies, support vector machines and random forest. And these are the results we got. So basically, both sensors did quite well. We had overall accuracies of 83 to 90% for differentiating 7 crop types. Surprisingly, we didn't find an increase in accuracy when we included shortwave infrared region information from PRISMA. We can also use full spectral analysis by using such things as spectral angle mapper. And so here are some examples of comparisons of the spectral profiles across different sensors and then with different crop types. So here is a quantitative comparison of using full spectral analyses versus optimal hyperspectral analyses using support vector machines and a thesis image in August of 2021. Here is a reference, the USDA cropland data layer, like Farther mentioned. And then for a comparison, we have the FSA results, which we used 59 of the thesis 4-bin product bands, and we got an overall accuracy of 97%. And this is very similar to the accuracy we got with using only 9 bands, which were the optimal hyperspectral narrow bands, with overall accuracy of 96%. And here is a similar comparison using Prisma image from August. And again, the FSA, which used 207 bands, yielded an overall accuracy of 96%, whereas the OHNB analysis, which only used 16 bands, yielded actually a slightly higher overall accuracy of 97%. So I just showed you some SVM results. Here, just to have a visual comparison, is a table showing the random forest results and the SAM, spectral angle mapper results. So you can see that the random forest also had relatively high overall accuracies, 89 to 92%. And then the SAM actually had much lower accuracies, and sometimes 54%. So we recommend random forest and support vector machines for these types of analyses. All right, so the fifth objective was to use deep learning rather than traditional machine learning algorithms for crop type classification. This is some really exciting work. And here we used harmonized Landsat Sentinel data, like Partha mentioned. We used a time series of those data. So for training the model, we used January through December 2021 data, and for validation, we used an independent year, January to December 2022. And so we put those data into an ARD data cube, like Partha mentioned, and then we took the USDA cropland data layer for reference. We put those into an artificial neural network called the multi-layer perceptron model. And that basically consists of one input layer, a few hidden layers. In this case, we used one, and then an output layer. We had about 89 bands that led to the 89 nodes of the input layer. We used a hidden layer that was about half that size. And then the output layer had 5 nodes corresponding with the 5 crop type classes that we were evaluating. And we're working on using the same model for hyperspectral data currently. Here is a little bit more detail about the input data. So we had HLS L30 imagery that we filtered by cloud cover, and then we masked out some cloudy and cloud aerosol pixels. We also masked out non-cropland areas, and then composited the images into monthly composites. We also calculated normalized difference vegetation index values, both monthly, seasonally, and annually. And then we gap filled with linear interpolation. And here are the results. So we have the cropland data layer as reference to the left here, and then the classification results for 2022. We had overall accuracy of 74%, and producers and users accuracies of 65 to 87%. So we can use OHNBs for classification. We can also use them to build hyperspectral vegetation indices like the ones you see here. They can be used for estimating various crop characteristics like pigment content, plant stress levels, wet and dry biomass, moisture, etc. And we're currently working on doing some of this with some field data that we recently collected and are collecting.